to turn on your camera. Feel free to turn on your cameras if you're comfortable. No pressure. Alrighty, I think we have a good group, so I think we can get started. Welcome everyone. I'm the president of the Corporate Communication Graduate Society, and we also have the MBA Club from Zicklin and the Baruch Industrial Organizational Psychology Group co-sponsoring this event today. We're just going to get started. So I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Medved, who is the Corporate Communication Masters of Arts Program Director, and she'll be moderating the panel for today.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Arva. And thank you for the opportunity to learn from all these wonderful people here today. I'm very excited about this. So we are going to spend some time talking about the field of HR and its many interconnections to all sorts of functions and elements in the organization. And we have three folks who have graciously agreed to spend some time with us today. And I know these are such busy times. So I appreciate you setting a little bit of time aside for all of us today very much. And we have three folks who are joining us. I'll just introduce them briefly and they'll share as they're talking about their experiences. I'm sure they'll share a little bit more about their backgrounds along the way. But we have Michelle Benvenisti, who is the Senior Director of Learning and Development at Sirius XM. Terrific. Thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, it's great. We have Nancy Dias, who is here from Boehringer Ingelheim Health. And thank you so much for joining us as well today. Terrific. And also Alwyn Dias as well, who is here. He is an executive coach and an HR consultant with just fabulously diverse set of work experiences and places around the world that he has been as well. So he's going to share his experiences with us as well today. So we're going to go ahead and just get started. So please feel free, as Arva just noted in the chat box, if you have questions, you're welcome as we're going to add them into the chat along the way, and then we'll do a Q&A at the end of our conversation today. But we hope to have just a free, relaxed, we can all build on each other's ideas conversation today. So as someone who's in communication, I know one of the most important things is to know your audience. And I would guess much of our audience are millennials, younger millennials perhaps, or perhaps some Zs who are in there as well. And so let's start there. Let's start with, from your perspectives, what are some of the benefits, major challenges, perhaps, that employers encounter today having such a predominance of millennials in the workplace? And it's a two-part question. So what are some of those challenges and benefits? But also, as we have experienced the pandemic, have you seen any generational differences in the ways that folks have responded to remote work and the return to work based on generation, or perhaps not? So I'll open that up. Whoever would like to start and share their thoughts, and we can go from there.
I'm happy to start, Karen. Thanks for the question. I actually have an incredible amount of respect for all generations, but specifically Gen Y, millennials, Gen Z, and what they have gone through and what they've experienced. And needless to say, these past 19 months have not been easy for any generation. But what I do think differentiates Gen Y and Gen Z from the boomers and Gen Xers is they got it right in terms of lifestyle and recognizing the importance of time, leisure time, and time away. And I think what we are seeing is that baby boomers and Gen Xers, have begun to have this moment of truth after the pandemic to say, what am I doing? where is my purpose? What am I about? When in fact, the millennials and Gen Z have been saying this all along. Are you crazy? I'm never going to work like you do, nor do I have to. So I think it's been a true wake-up call, especially in light of the great resignation that we're seeing and what's going on in our business. In our businesses in general, I think we have to completely change the format of what work looks like and where work can be done, right? So it's not just the workplace, it's a new place. And in some cases, it was for some people going back home to take care of parents, to be with parents, to give up their apartments and just go back home. If they were in big cities and that had high rates of COVID. And suddenly we all became, I think, tethered to our laptops and Zoom or Microsoft Teams. And it was very hard because we lost a sense of human interaction. And when I say, sort of that across the table type of thing, and we all felt like we were, but one thing I will say, and then I'd love to hear from Michelle and Alwyn, is that hierarchy went to the side. So everybody was in the same size square, right? Everyone had the same technical issues. If, there wasn't privilege, that was playing through. So I think what we have learned about this is that we can treat each other in more equitable ways than we've ever done virtually. And yes, you can argue and say that there was also room for a bit more informality that could have been offensive for people. But the reality is that we were all on the same level playing field. So I'll just stop there and let my colleagues add more. I
can jump in. Thanks, Nancy. I can echo everything that you just mentioned. I work with many different types of organizations, and the ones that I've seen struggle during this time are the ones that actually really focus their culture around what Nancy just mentioned. The traditional sit in a conference room or sit in the waiting room waiting for the executive to let you come into this luxurious office. And it completely got leveled, so that nervousness that millennials would feel in talking to senior directors or senior leaders in general was alleviated a bit. And I found that millennials were more able to share their ideas more efficiently and also able to be themselves and not have to fit this mold that they feel they need to because of what's around them. The other component is I say this to my students, that high performers that are millennials have memory. They're going to remember how an organization has treated them before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and now after the pandemic. They're not going to forget what that was like. And so not only is there the big resignation, as Nancy said, but on top of that, you have millennials and employees at different levels saying, you know what, life is important, and I didn't feel important during the pandemic. And so I'm going to take this time to move on. So,
that's powerful.
Thank you.
Yeah, Michelle, your thought?
Yeah, I would just add, well, I should share personally that I started a new job during the pandemic. I left my company that I was with for 11 years because I wanted a new opportunity. I wanted to completely have an entirely new endeavor. And when I started with Sirius XM, I realized as I was meeting people that, what you had mentioned, Nancy, about that level, everything's equal when you're on a Zoom. That made it so much easier for me to engage with leaders across the organization. So I would echo that it really became more of an equal playing field and more comfortable to interact with people. But, you talked about the great resignation, Nancy, and I had read something, and I'm just going to look at, the numbers for this, but a recent PricewaterhouseCoopers survey indicated that 65% of all US employees are looking for a job. 65%. And I'm not sure how that relates to the different generations and the percentage of people that are looking. But I do think that when we're in this environment in which we are remote, it creates that comfort to, talk to other companies. All you're doing is going from one click to the next click. So it's making it much easier to engage. And I think also that the culture has changed where companies are now companies that are flexible are more of an employee-driven culture. And hopefully companies are listening to their employees, in particular millennials, who are saying, here are some of the things that we want. They want to ensure that there's visibility into career pathing, that's not behind the scenes, that's just, something that HR has access to, that they truly believe that the company is invested in their career growth, and not just saying that, but being able to support that financially, being able to ensure that that's something that, we're investing in each individual and having the budget for it, that we're providing a flexible work environment. We talked about that before people joined, that this environment of work versus personal is much more blended. And so if it is going to be more blended, companies should be accommodating to some of the things that are happening personally and the flexibility that's needed, especially for people that, have kids in their household and, a lot going on in our personal lives. I also think that it's really important, and, Alwyn and Nancy, in particular Nancy, with the work that you do, can speak to this, that millennials care about what we're doing for our communities. They care about what companies are doing to support the community, and they care about diversity. And diversity, equity, and inclusion is not just a training program that you check off the list. It's truly making sure that you have a culture of diversity of thought, diversity of people, diversity of ideas. And I can really appreciate that so much of that is coming from the millennials saying, hey, here's what we want. You want us to stay? Here's what we want.
And I think, Michelle, that is so crucial, because what we have seen with this generation is their desire to hold leadership's feet to the fire around social justice, around the environment, and our social responsibility. Also, around sustainability. So it's not just, it's getting rid of styrofoam cups, right? It's having to-go coffee cups, that are recyclable. It's also looking at your policies. Are they updated enough to support today's family or today's way of living? And what I mean by today's family is looking at parental leave, right, as something that needs to be more than 2 weeks long. These types of fringe benefits, if you will, or extended benefits are important. Fertility coverage, fertility counseling for women. What we're seeing with this generation is a postponement of having children as they continue on in their careers. So we're not seeing we're not seeing some of these millennials have children at an earlier age. They're waiting until their late 30s, in some cases even 40s, which would be Gen Y, to have children. So I think, Karen, when you asked your very specific question, I think the challenge that we face is how do we keep the millennials, how do we retain that talent, recognizing that things are changing so rapidly. And the one thing, Michelle, and thanks for pointing that out, that I would say is so important and has been for the past 19 months. Corporate America and the world became woke after George Floyd. There's no question about that. And I think every American company changed their way of looking at social justice and their commitments. Now, you can say you have a diversity and inclusion program. You can donate or contribute to the NAACP. You can have millions of dollars and give that. But if your practices and culture don't support that, it doesn't matter how much money you give. The millennials can see right through that. Any employee can see right through that. I think that it's much more acute with millennials and Gen Z. They think about it much more. It's much more top of mind. In many ways, generally speaking, I'm not suggesting that other generations don't find this critical as well, but the question was specific about millennials. That's why I went there.
No, that's right.
If I can just touch on
Alwyn,
millennials, if I can speak to the millennials and so on, know that your voices are heard. So don't be afraid to share your opinion, because I'm in the Gen X phase where you kind of have to go along with it just to survive. But now, and walking with your feet didn't exist. Now it's a reality. And your opinion counts. So I would just say, hone in on what you believe, hone in on what your values are, think about what you want to say, and be confident in sharing it.
And Alwyn, for those of us who are also in the Gen X category, it's wonderful to learn and see other people in the workplace doing, as you said, sharing their voices, being assertive, sharing what they think is important, down to, as Nancy was saying, the recycling issues on a daily basis. I think that's empowering for all of us to see. I have certainly appreciated and learned from my millennial colleagues as well over the last few years too. So Michelle, did you?
Yeah, one of the things that I was thinking when, we were talking about companies, that millennials can see through this if companies aren't genuine with this, is, companies are, they may make that donation, as, we share, they may make that donation or have a training session that they think is covering it, or what they may do is, and this is one of the challenges that relates to, part of the original question, is they may assume or put the responsibility on people within HR to say, hey, now we need to focus on diversity and inclusion. So HR business partner, we're going to ask you to handle diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the HR business partners and people who don't have that background realize that they're not the skilled people to be able to, or as skilled to be able to do that. And so millennials, I think, can see through that as well, in terms of, if we're going to support this, are we going to dedicate a resource or a team that's willing to ensure that we're looking at it more holistically, whether that's having a diversity officer or just, ensuring that we've got people who have that lens across the organization on that.
Yeah, certainly a challenge, a big challenge, no question about it. Well, let's talk about one of you. There's so many different pieces. Talking, I had 10 more questions that all popped into my mind, but let's draw down to one issue that a number of you touched on, which is sort of this balance between work and life, right? And how that's shifting and changing, and how the pandemic has also affected those perceptions. And so maybe you could tell us a little bit about the organizations that you work in or work with, how they're sort of rethinking work and life. What are they doing to provide that flexibility? And particularly as you're making interesting challenges and changes with the return to work, or how much of a return to work, the physical workplace that all of us are struggling with. in so many ways right now. So how is work and family being redefined these days?
Well, I'll start, Karen. I think there are a couple of realizations that came to the forefront, and one was the mental health and wellness component of the past 18, 19 months it has had on each of us. Again, I like to, I don't like to say, I say that we're all in the same storm, but different boats, all right? Some of us are navigating in yachts, others are in rowboats, others don't have a paddle, and some of us are just floating right through. And I think the realization of the impact and the way the pressures of even our own employees and their loved ones, perhaps, contracting COVID, losing loved ones from COVID, having to manage elderly parents or children while they're on calls, recognizing that there was a significant need for us to change the way that we cared and supported our employees. So I think one of the top elements that came from this is manage your energy, take energy breaks. And that doesn't mean, try to block out that 11:30 to 1 o'clock window. So preserve that time for yourself. Or if you're a late luncher, take that 3 o'clock walk to go get whatever, a Starbucks, whatever you need to do, go to the gym, work out, do yoga. And we encourage that. We also changed our meeting structures. Instead of them running for 30 minutes, because, on the phone, you don't have to walk down the hallway or on Zoom to get to another meeting. And invariably, we would always be late. What was happening is that people were going from 9 to 10, and they'd come in 10:02, and they'd never have time to just kind of close out the last meeting, take notes of what they had to do or what their actions were, and then just enter in. So we decided to change meetings to 25 minutes instead of 30, 45 minutes instead of an hour. And so we try to wrap up 5 minutes before the hour or at the bottom of the hour to do that. Are we great at it? We've improved. Some people just say, oh, I've got 5 more minutes. Let me run it to, the top of the hour. But I do think recognizing the need for forums, for support, for holding space and grace for employees to express how they're feeling. We hosted a variety of courageous conversations, which I moderated with our senior leaders. And it pretty much ran like a radio show. It was like a call-in. People could put their cameras on if they wanted. They didn't have to. And it was just one question, what's coming up for you today? What are you feeling right now? And that's all we talked about. I mean, we had some ground rules, but the fact that we created that forum in that trifecta of uncertainty last year between the election uncertainties, right, the Capitol insurgents, the multiple deaths, and George Floyd kind of being the pinnacle of what drove all of that. I think the company realized that we have to take a stand, and we introduced something called being an upstander. So we listened to our employees. We made some changes. We provided a lot of mental health and wellness support, and we continue to do that because it's been a very difficult time for all of us.
Absolutely.
And we acknowledge it.
Yeah. And issues of mental health in the workplace were already starting to become much more visible, and then this happened.
Exactly.
So, yeah. Michelle, thoughts?
Yeah, mental health, physical overall well-being is something that people finally really feel comfortable talking about and open about. This is, my personal experience when I was choosing the company that I wanted to work for and work with. It was important that they took that seriously. I had COVID. I had a very, very bad case of it. very lucky to be here today. I will say that, very lucky to be here today. And when I started with my current company, I was so impressed at how they pivoted to this new environment and how they took mental health seriously, but our overall physical well-being. And, you know, some of the things that Nancy had mentioned, our company is doing as well. They have also moved to, I would say right now, it's been the case for since the pandemic, where on Fridays we have early closings at 12:30. So that is just that time for you to just restore yourself, and you can work, but you don't have to work. And when I started here, I have to say, I asked, you know, someone on my team, is this really true? I wasn't used to that at all. And I said, is this really true? And what really affirmed it for me was when the CEO had said it on a call and has mentioned it several times, how important this is. And we also had an email that said, please do not schedule meetings on Fridays after 12:30. So it really is about walking the talk with it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fabulous. Yeah.
So, I mean, again, I can echo everything that Michelle and Nancy just mentioned. The one thing that as an executive coach, the one thing that I've implemented when I work with executives, in the first 10 minutes of a session, I don't jump into a coaching session. I actually ask them, I assume you're going back to back. Do you need 10 minutes? And we can turn our cameras off, we can go on mute, and you can have the 10 minutes. And the relief on their faces, in fact, when I have coaching sessions, they've told me that they look forward to it because they get the 10 minutes. So there's different ways of being, you have to be, leaders have gotten to be very creative in how they have to work with their employees and meeting them where they are versus the opposite. I found that the Fridays, you know, there's a lot of work from home Fridays, no meetings on Fridays. One organization, you know, it's casual and they work from home and they really live up to it, but you know, they enforce the fact that individuals should be taking that time. And then the other side to it is, you know, having your cubicle or office is no longer. Individuals are wanting to work at workstations and come in on certain days and stay home on certain days. And so the conversation isn't, you know, how do we accommodate, you know, everybody coming back? The question is, how do we structure schedules so that we have individuals coming in and being at home? Like, so there's equity.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's great. Well, and I think that's such a fascinating phenomenon to watch, right? And to experience. Are there challenges with that though, in terms of competing needs and interests between organizations you've worked with or leaders you've worked with and employees, or is that a mindset that we need to?
I'll take that. I was an HR business partner for like 18 to 20 years. I really don't, it could be any type of universe. We're going to have issues. Somebody is going to find some issue in regards to what they don't like because they feel somebody else has it and they don't. And, you know, yes, the pandemic completely changed the board completely. It took the board away. But managing what the needs are for employees holistically versus hitting, you know, the pain points that people feel due to their complaints, you can run yourselves ragged if you're just following the complaints. But if you work towards the better good and the holistic better good of employees, then you're working on growth versus, you know, putting out fires.
You know, Alwyn, I couldn't agree more. And by the way, I knew I worked with Alwyn when he was becoming a an HRBP. So he and I go way back. So it's great to see every time he and I are in these shared venues. It's always a joy for me to connect with him. But I digress. I wanted to say, in response to your question, that I think we as individuals sometimes are our own worst enemy. So I think we feel guilty if we're not accessible and if we're not overperforming. And I think you might see a little bit more of this with the Gen X and baby boomer generations. Oh, I'm home. What else am I going to do? I should be working. And that's not the mindset or the mentality that we want our colleagues or employees to have. But yet, I don't know any one of us that leaves the house without our phone, right? In today's world. And I think it's really important that we give ourselves that virtual 10 minutes that Alwyn so graciously gives his coaching clients. We need that. The brain does not function well without a break. And any neuroscientist will tell you that you can't multitask. And if you can't clear the space to reconnect with a new situation, you're never going to be present in any one situation. So I think the key for most of us as leaders is to learn how to be present in the moment. And this has really forced many leaders, some who are all over the place, to be focused and not be distracted. And so I think that forgiveness, that self-forgiveness part in giving yourself, holding space for yourself, is a discipline that many leaders are not good at.
Yeah, when listening to both of what you're sharing, it comes to mind how important it is now to be empathetic. And, holding space, Alwyn, I love the way you say that, holding space for that 10 minutes of, it's now a good time, or turn off the video. But also, how do we engage in conversations that aren't always task oriented? And, when we were in the office, we had that luxury of just walking by people and chatting, and that water cooler chat. And we don't have that luxury anymore. And I think one of the challenges is building relationships, especially if you're new and you've been working in a virtual environment, is much more challenging. And so, regardless of if it's 4.5 days or 5 days, it's really, really tough in this environment to build new relationships. And you have to be thoughtful about it. You have to be mindful of it. I think leaders in particular should take advantage of opportunities to reach out to people, to have skip level meetings, because people aren't walking by their office for them to discuss and chat and find out how they're doing. So that I think is a really important part, that people just not just need to be more empathetic, but more intentional with how they are building those relationships across the organization.
Absolutely. And we started off with the notion of generation, but in some ways, Michelle, you're adding on what stage you are in your career. Also, you may have experienced remote work differently. You may have different needs at different points in your career. So, how do we manage that in this work environment? I think that's really important.
Yeah. And that's the other part where I think intentional comes into play, that when I'm coaching leaders, I talk about this, that, in the past, when you were all in the office, you'd, let's say, walk out of a meeting and you could debrief, you could chat, you can give feedback and say, hey, you did a really great job with this. And now it's from Zoom room to Zoom room, it's click to click. And so how are we following up and just having discussions, but not also taking up more time, more Zoom time, when people are really, I think, experiencing that fatigue? And you don't have to be in the workplace to experience. Everybody that's in this Zoom room has experienced this, being students as well. So being intentional and mindful and empathetic, all of those are important characteristics or behaviors to to employ when you're interacting and engaging with others.
Absolutely. And in some ways, all the examples you've given us, right, are ones that I like to call sort of the hidden obvious, right? They're easy things to do. Giving someone 10 minutes at the beginning of a meeting, or the spacing of your meetings, or taking a break and a walk, are things that, you know, don't require huge amounts of resources. They just take consciousness, you know, and so you've just given us some wonderful ideas, both personally how we can do that, but also how in your roles you're doing that as well. Well, you all sound so wonderfully suited in so many ways to what you do. So maybe we can go back for a minute. And what initially attracted you to want to work in the field of HR?
I'll jump in.
Please.
So I actually was I actually got my master's in social work.
Yeah.
And I worked with the substance abuse population as well as the Children's Aid Society at one point with their mentors. And I realized that the skills were transferable into HR, but what drove me to HR is the parallel of what I was doing in my work. I was working with diverse populations, and at that time, it wasn't diversity, equity, and inclusion. It wasn't diversity and inclusion. It was just diversity, and that drove me because I thought, wow, I can actually be a part of changing a culture that alienates populations, that marginalizes populations. So that drove me. That's what really drove me to HR. And then when I got into HR, there were the mentors, which Nancy was, of mine, that showed me that I didn't need to fit this pre-manufactured mold of an employee. I could really just be myself and succeed. And honestly, that lesson has stayed with me up until right now. I don't think without that lesson, I wouldn't be comfortable speaking on a panel like this at all. I'm a little intimidated because Nancy's on this panel, but it is what it is.
That's terrific. We meet wonderful people sometimes along the way. So that's great.
Well, Alwyn, thank you. I hope you're not intimidated at all. You know, I know you said that because you're so humble in general, but I think I never expected, you know, that I would wind up in HR. I got to HR unexpectedly, primarily because I really found my strengths in educating and teaching people. I was on the retail side of banking when I was involved and very much involved in technology. But I was also closeted at the time and really lived in the closet and didn't come out until my mid-30s. And I was also a female, you know, rising in the organization. And I saw how women were treated. Mm-hmm. And at that time, in the late 80s and early 90s, women in financial services couldn't even wear slacks to work. You know, you had to wear dresses. And I'm a tailored kind of person, and wearing a dress to me was truly like, you know, forcing me into a uniform that was not being my authentic self. And then, as similar to Alwyn, as we started to evolve, and at that time, Chase, before it was JP Morgan Chase, was probably one of the top companies in the world introducing diversity and inclusion. And like any organization that starts out, they usually start with women because they start with gender balance and gender equity. But we quickly moved on to race and ethnicity. And Alwyn and I were part of a big HR circle of trusted confidence. To this day, 20 years later, he and I are still friends. So I think it speaks to the level of trust that we developed. I do this work because I had a series of pretty awful managers in my career. And I was treated horribly. I also was part of the Me Too experience when I think about that. But, you know, I sound like an old lady, but in those days, you didn't talk about it. You just sort of grin and you swallowed it. And I believe that many of us who have been in the corporate world for many years have a version of corporate PTSD, you know, from all those scenarios that happened to us that we just sort of, you know, grin and bit our tongues and moved on. But I don't think we realize how much better, and this is how much stronger, I should say, we are, and how united we are, and which is why I'm such a maniac on these topics, right? I'm unrelenting, and I think, you know, I will carry this with me till my last, you know, breathing moment on this planet. But I truly believe in equity. I am horrified at the amount of inequities that we see. And being in a role like this, I really feel like you have the influence to help the underserved and to help patients that have been marginalized and don't have access to healthcare. So for me, it was very purposeful to get into healthcare and to make a difference, to ensure that patients have affordable access to medicines. They're included in clinical studies. And so I've dedicated much of my work. This is not a job for me. This is my life's work. So anyway, that's what got me here, because it's a forum and a place for me to be my best self.
Michelle, how did you find your way into HR?
So in particular, learning and development, one thing that's so critical is just finding the right culture, the right company. So even if you've got the right skills, you have to find that fit. And Nancy, something you said resonated for me. I remember I'm a Generation X person, and I remember many years ago, I was sent home because the head of the department did not like the pants that I was wearing. Mm-hmm. So they weren't appropriate for the work environment, is what I was told. Meanwhile, they were just tailored, you know, mm-hmm. And you had to wear pantyhose to work. And here I am working customer service on a phone. And I thought, who's going to see me? But right. That aside, how I chose what I'm doing, which is learning and development, is I had to tap into those things that are most important to me. And, you know, it related to something I had actually learned recently, which is about ikigai. I don't know if I may be mispronouncing it, but it's a Japanese phrase that means it's a reason to live. It's why you get up in the morning. And there are 4 factors, and there are 4 factors that I often ask myself about to make sure that I'm in that happy place. It's doing what you love, doing what you're good at, doing what the world needs, and getting paid for it. And, and if you may have 1, you may have 2 or 3, it's hard to find all, but it's not impossible to find all. And I think the most important thing that I did along the way, and I continue to do, is self-reflection of, am I in my happy place? Am I making sure that I am fulfilled? And my fulfillment really comes from making sure that I'm in a position to help other people. So learning and development is the right place for me, without a doubt. Teaching business skills, communication skills, presentation skills, management skills. They're really, it's about people skills that I'm focusing on. So that's what attracted me to HR in general, and in particular, learning and development.
If I can just touch base on what Michelle just said, and with a quick story. I had a high school intern that was working in our department, and she asked me the same question of, you know, how did I end up as an HR business partner? And I said I started off in social work, and I went on about how much I loved doing one-on-one counseling, doing therapy, doing some type of coaching. And she said, well, why didn't you stay? And I said, well, at that time, it was September 11th, and there weren't a lot of jobs. So I got an opportunity and I kind of went forward. So she said, so you forgot about what you really like doing and now you're doing this? And I mean, this is like 15 years into my career. And I was like, yeah, I did. And I just got completely schooled by an 16-year-old. And she was absolutely right. And, you know, it took me some time, but I needed to figure out what my passion was. And everything Michelle just said lives so true. If you want to live a happy, content life, you've got to go for those principles that Michelle just mentioned. You're on mute.
Well, I'll add in a thought there, perhaps an additional question. Somewhat was asked in the chat box here too, but maybe then what other advice would you have? You know, folks are in a graduate program, some of them are coming straight from undergrad and sort of finding that initial first perspective. Some of them are career changers, right? Some of them are have gone through this questioning process during COVID and resignation and are coming back to find a new career. Other advice that you would have for graduate students who are interested in doing the kinds of work that you all are doing to help them on that path?
Well, you know,
Oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Michelle.
I would say, and this actually started with Arba and I, right? We had a conversation, and it was through a mutual connection that we had. And she had said, would you like to have a conversation with Arba? And I said, absolutely. And we had a wonderful conversation about learning and development. And through that discussion, I thought it would be really helpful for her to meet with a former colleague of mine. And Arba had the opportunity to talk to a former colleague of mine who had an HR business partner role. And my advice would be to everybody here is to ask for those introductions, to start to build your network, to ask questions of them about what they do, what they love, but also parts of the role that they may not love, because then you really get a full perspective of it. And as an example, when I'm having conversations with people about learning and development pre-COVID, you know, they'd say, oh, you get to travel. Well, in these conversations, I also talk about that there's a downside of that too, and there's a sacrifice with it. So even though I mentioned Ikigai and finding that happy place, you also have to ask the questions about things you wish you would have known. You know it now, but what did you wish you would have known with your role? And I would highly recommend that you ask questions not only related to the great things about a role, but also the things that might make it more challenging. And at the end of every meeting, always ask for, who do you recommend that I speak to learn more?
I think, you know, I'm asked this question a lot. What advice do you have for me? And I want to go back to Alwyn's statement. You're at a pivotal point in your careers right now, or in your education, to change your career or pursue a career. And I think you have to remember your why. What is your North Star? And you have to approach every opportunity as a beginner and not an expert. And I think if you approach the experience as a beginner, and, you know, what do I need to learn? But also, I did see the question from Casey come through out there around the culture, and I recognize Casey may want to hear this on the recording. I think in the interview process, or as you're assessing a company, whether it's through LinkedIn posts, ask to meet with somebody from an employee resource group or an employee network group to really understand their commitment to diversity and inclusion. And if they don't have employee network groups or resource groups, I will tell you that they're probably not as advanced in terms of a culture that you're looking for. So that's one way to assess whether this is right. But I challenge you to go back to what's driving you to pursue this field. And as Michelle pointed out, a lot of people think that this is a great job. And don't get me wrong, it's very rewarding, but it's also very difficult. It's very draining. It's very exhausting. And even the HR business partner role, there are great opportunities to be aligned with the business, to make change happen. But take a George Floyd situation and how that turns a company and the world upside down. And you have to be courageous and out there and willing to stand on a main stage, figuratively, and be able to state a company position. And hopefully you're able to believe you stand with that position and it agrees with your values. So I think finding a company's culture that aligns with your personal values, your professional values, and the way to test that is either through your network, as Michelle pointed out, but also through the recruiter and the interviewers. And if you have friends that work at that company, ask them for, take them out for lunch, invest in, a lunch or a coffee or something to get the inside skinny.
I'd be echoing what both Michelle and Nancy said about, and I get this question a lot from my students in regards to what advice. And I always say leverage, if you don't necessarily have the network professionally, you're in school. So you have faculty that have the network. So leverage your faculty, because your faculty
Excellent.
will assist you in getting and expanding your network. The other point on asking the question, when you're in an interview and you're asking a question, you're not necessarily asking the question to just get the answer. You're asking the question to see how the question is being answered. So for instance, if you ask, what does success look like for somebody in this role after 6 months? And the answer is very ambiguous. Well, that's what it's going to be like for you in 6 months when you're trying to figure out, am I doing a good job or not? So to Nancy's point, asking the questions and understanding yourself and aligning your values, what makes you comfortable, what drives you to what you're going for is critical. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not easy and it doesn't happen quickly, but don't be like me and wait 15 years to realize it. You're like Nancy said, you're at a pivotal point to really launch. So, there's a lot of thought. And again, it's not easy, but the dividends come in time.
Thank you. I'm going to hand things over to Arva, I believe, who's going to share some of the final questions that we had on the chat for our last few minutes. So Arva, please.
Thank you. All right, so we have one question from Professor Baer, our faculty advisor. He's asking about the current cancel culture and its impacts on HR. Every day we hear about someone being fired or having posted something insensitive or tweeted something offensive, sometimes years or decades earlier, and there's usually no room for nuance in resolving these issues. What are your visions for how this phenomena will impact recruiting and retaining talent in the future? And what is the role in HR in making these types of termination decisions? Sorry, I know it's
I'll take that from an HR VP perspective. And I teach this in my class. Social media is a great tool, but it can also be a horrible one. The way that you represent yourself is how you're going to be seen. When you're interviewing for a position or meeting somebody for a networking session, you're going to be Googled. People are going to do their own research because they want to be prepared for the meeting that they're going to have with you. And we, through social media, need to be very careful of how we want to be represented. Now, should there be issues in the past and things come up, there are some things that we can control and there's some things that we can't. We've all, at least I have led, different stages of my life, some that I don't want to live again and some that I would. But the piece here is to constantly improve, but also be conscious of what's out there. So Google yourself, see what's out there. And if you don't like what's out there, now's the time to figure out how to change it. And in terms of terminations and cancel culture, every organization is different, especially in this time. I could say one organization has zero tolerance for certain issues, whereas another organization would see it as a point of corrective action. So it's, especially in this time, the way social media is just changing and how protected classes are expanding, it's going to evolve. And I work with a former judge, and he said that policies and laws are created through times of change and learning. We're in that time of change and learning. So policies are going to start to evolve. So, is there a cancel culture? Yeah, but there's a lot underneath that is relative to the organization you're looking at.
I couldn't agree more, Alwyn. And I think to that question, what has really been helpful for companies today is to anchor their decisions in company values, irrespective of whether this happened 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and a code of conduct, right? If you're, when you look at these behaviors, whether it was, I personally am not in favor of going back 25 years for a long tenured employee. You have different leadership, there were different rules at that time or guidelines, but for any employee that's currently there, I do think that people have to renew their vows, if you will, to the company and their commitment to be respectful, empathetic, trustworthy. And if they're not following in those guidelines, then I think the company has the right to terminate an employee based on those guidelines. So I think companies have even a better chance now and laws on their side, anti-hate laws, anti-discrimination protection that we never had 20 years ago at the same rate. So reinforcing your values and using that as your benchmark to say this is unacceptable. I don't want to get too political, but it gets in the category of companies mandating certain behaviors that, as Alwyn said, zero tolerance to, letting things slide because so-and-so is a top performer. That you can't be inconsistent. You have to be consistent, irrespective of where they sit in the organization.
So I'll just be brief, piggybacking on what I'm, hearing. And, one is we're calling it cancel culture, and I feel like it does a disservice to what's really happening. And I wish we could change the language. It's really about transition culture. We're going through a transition, and, and if you have a growth mindset, and this is something I talk about from a learning and development perspective about, what's your mindset? Is it a fixed mindset or a growth mindset? If you adopt a growth mindset, then you'll see that we're going through a transition. And when I say we, it's the collective we, but also individually. We're all going through it, and that's creating some of what we shared earlier about some of the, the challenges we're experiencing and the stress that we're experiencing. But having that growth mindset to the transition that's happening. From a social media perspective, I would just say that, it's really important for us to, and Alwyn, you touched upon this, I think, very well, in that we need to be mindful of what our brand is. You know, we often talk about a brand from a company perspective, but we should be thinking about it from a personal perspective. What's the brand that I want to create? How am I perceived? Whether that's the perception of me engaging and interacting with people, or how am I perceived if somebody were to look me up online? So that personal and professional brand, it's not one or the other, it's combined. What is the brand that you want to create? How do you want to be perceived?
Thank you so much, all. And then just one last question for the sake of time. Charles asks, as an LGBT plus military veteran from the don't ask, don't tell era in the 1990s, I can relate to emotional PTSD. Any advice on dealing with moments that can trigger extremely painful memories, especially in professional situations?
Well, from my vantage point, I have not perfected that myself. What I do remember, though, is again, I go back to being in the moment. And even though it triggers a past experience, I tell myself that I'm safe, I'm okay, I'm loved, I'm supported. And I try to do a quick personal affirmation and leave the situation. So I'll exit physically. If I'm in I'll say, I can't do this right now. And I have walked out of meetings where it was too difficult for me and through my career. And I encourage you to take that time and space. If it's too difficult for you, you have the right to say, I can't do this now. Alwyn, he's our social worker, so I'm sure he has much better advice.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure about better advice. Everybody's experience is going to be different, and how they receive reactions or behaviors of other people that trigger us. We all feel triggered in different ways. It's going to happen, and how we react is important. I say in my workshops of unconscious biases, don't let your unconscious biases dictate your behavior. So knowing that things are going to be triggering, think about what would be your best move when something like that happens, so that you're not thinking in the moment. Nancy mentions removing yourself. Okay, removing yourself. So when you hear something, you're not going to be surprised by your own behavior by leaving the room. Just thinking about it beforehand, because it's unfortunately out there. The other is lean into your family. And when I say family, I don't necessarily mean blood family or anything like that. Lean into your family of comfort, or your circle of comfort. Don't forget that they're there with you, and they're there to support you. And you don't have to go it alone.
I would just add to that sometimes when we plan, it feels right on paper, but when we're in the moment, it feels entirely different. I would say to also be in touch with those things that give you energy, that recharge you. And there have been a couple of experiences in my prior company in which I had to hit the pause button, and I didn't know what I was going to do. I did not know how to respond. And I hit the pause button. Part of the pause button for me was that statement of, I need some time. I need some time to process this. And what I did during my pause was I went upstairs and up to the roof. I live in a New York City apartment building. I went upstairs to the roof just to get fresh air. And so my recommendation would be what we're hearing from Nancy and Alwyn, to really think through, how do you want to handle that if you do come across that situation, and also reserve the right that you may not know in that moment. And it's okay to just hit pause and find the ways that you can lean on the people that you know, or recharge. And if it's fresh air or something else, do that.
Thank you so much, all. For the sake of time, I think we'll be wrapping it up now, but it was a pleasure hearing your insights and your experience, Michelle, Nancy, and Alwyn, and Dr. Medved. Thank you so much for moderating this wonderful panel. I will just give another quick shout out to our co-sponsoring clubs, the IO Site Club and the MBA Club. Thank you so much all. Before everyone kind of heads out, can we do a really quick photo? If you feel comfortable, jump on camera. If not, no worries. All right, Matilda, it's all you.
Okay, everyone. So if you would like to strike a pose or something, that would be great. I'm gonna count down to 3 and take a little screenshot. So here we go. 1, 2, 3. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. It's nice meeting all of you. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much. I learned so much. It was wonderful.
Thank you all for such thoughtful questions and great
Mm.
partnership.
We
Bye-bye.
could have kept going
Likewise.
for
Take care,
hours.
guys.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.